Welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is November 28th, 2021, and I'm your host, James Myers. It is an honor to be joined in dialogues by participants from the Toronto Philosophy and Calgary Philosophy Meetup groups. Whether you have been with us before or are here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. I'll begin by introducing one of the key themes from today's reading selection, which covers part of Book 7 of the Republic in passages from Stephanus reference 521a to 541b. Then I will invite participants to exchange their thoughts on the text, and as I do so, I'll briefly summarize and try to connect different perspectives to a common thread of ideas. I've suggested 3 themes to focus our discussion, which are posted on the shared drive that is linked to the event notice on meetup.com. We can go anywhere the group chooses, but for everyone's benefit, I would ask that you relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. To contribute your thoughts, please use the raise hands feature in Zoom. Calling the first name as it appears on your screen profile, I will invite you to speak in the order that hands are raised, giving precedence to those who haven't spoken before. After we finish recording in 2 hours, I invite any participants who wish to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. So 2 weeks ago, our 4th session on the Republic began with Socrates' declaration that until philosophers rule, there will be no end to evils in the city or in the human race. We discussed the soul of a philosopher as that which hates falsehood. The philosopher's soul applies reason to seek eternal truths, which cannot be found among the sensory images of a constantly changing physical world. Socrates and his friends agreed that the philosopher understands the difference between the eternal, unchanging being of a thing and the thing's many varied images in the continual state of coming to be in the present. That led us to a fascinating discussion on the nature of time, which we will now revisit. But before introducing today's reading, I want to note that in 2 weeks, before we break for the holidays, we will conclude our 6-part series on the Republic by reading from 587b through the end of Book 10 at 621d. I'm very much looking forward to that discussion, when we will have the opportunity to consider the conclusion on the subject of justice with which Plato began the Republic. So today we will pick up on the theme we ended with 2 weeks ago, which is the type of education and knowledge that equips a philosopher to apply intelligence to understand the intelligible. Intelligence requires reason, which is absent in the sensory data that the soul receives in the present state of coming to be. It is the soul's task, Socrates says in the conclusion of the Republic, to distinguish imitation from the real. And at the outset of today's reading, he says the first order of knowledge for this purpose is knowledge of number and calculation. So let's begin today's dialogue with Socrates' question at 521d, where he asks what subject it is that draws the soul from the realm of becoming, which is the uncertain state of coming to be in the present, to the realm of what is, where there is certainty of truth. His answer follows at 522c, that the first subject for any philosopher is number and calculation, which he demonstrates with 3 fingers. It may seem unusual to us now, 2,400 years later, when number and calculation don't normally feature in the curriculum for philosophy students. But Socrates' point is really about our ability to navigate the differences that are with us every moment that we navigate the physical world. The physical world, we now know from Isaac Newton's third law of motion, operates in equal and opposite measures of action and reaction, and it does so according to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So distinguishing what is different from what is the same is intrinsic to our physical existence and, as Socrates repeatedly asserts, is fundamental to our understanding of time. Socrates divides time into 2 different categories. In one are the past and future that are continuous in being that never becomes, and in the other, there is the present, which is the changing realm of becoming that never is. So let's see if we can understand what Socrates means in his 3-finger demonstration from 523d to 523d to 524e. Then let's discuss the difference in the meanings of the word calculation. And so here, let me share my screen. And I want to just put my fingers up as Socrates did. And he puts up 3 fingers in this demonstration, his 2nd, 3rd, and 5th finger. And I'll just read this section here. He says, it's apparent that each of them is equally a finger, and it makes no difference in this regard whether the finger is seen to be in the middle or at either end, whether it is dark or pale, thick or thin, or anything else of that sort. For in all these cases, an ordinary soul isn't compelled to ask the understanding what a finger is, since sight doesn't suggest to it that a finger is at the same time the opposite of a finger. So here he's saying, I'll just break that reading. Here he's saying that we just sort of intrinsically understand what a finger is, whether it's a finger on an old person, a young person, whether it's a dark finger or a light finger, thick or thin, short, stubby, or long. We just intuitively understand what a finger is. So he goes on to say, therefore, it isn't likely that anything of that sort would summon or awaken the understanding. But what about the bigness and smallness of fingers? Does sight perceive them adequately? Does it make no difference to it whether the finger is in the middle or at the end? And is it the same with the sense of touch as regards the thick and the thin, the hard and the soft? And do the other senses reveal such things clearly and adequately? Doesn't each of them rather do the following? The sense set over the hard is, in the first place, of necessity, also set over the soft, and it reports to the soul that the same thing is perceived by it to be both hard and soft. And isn't it necessary that in such cases the soul is puzzled as to what this sense means by the hard if it indicates that the same thing is also soft, or what it means by the light and the heavy if it indicates that the heavy is light or the light heavy? I'll just break again there and just say that here he's setting up this idea of opposite. So we understand intuitively what a finger is, whether it's a finger on a human, whether it's a finger on an animal. We understand it really, I think, maybe because of its function, and we can discuss that more. But once we understand what a finger is, then there are many different types of fingers. And here's where he's starting to talk about the opposites. So some fingers, you can perceive a finger to be hard in one sense, but then you can touch it and it gives to the touch. So in some senses, it's soft. So maybe this kind of idea of relativity, is a finger is hard compared to some things, but it's soft compared to other things. And that's really saying that it's sort of this, the soul is summoning this kind of understanding of these differences. And so he goes on to say, then it's likely that in such cases, the soul, summoning calculation and understanding, first tries to determine whether each of the things announced to it is one or two. If it's evidently two, won't each be evidently distinct in one? Then if each is one and both two, the soul will understand that the two are separate, for it wouldn't understand the inseparable to be two, but rather one. Sight, however, saw the big and the small, not as separate, but as mixed up together. And in order to get clear about all this, understanding was compelled to see the big and the small, not as mixed up together, but as separate, the opposite way from sight. And because of this, we called the one the intelligible and the other the visible. If something opposite to it is always seen at the same time, so that nothing is apparently any more than the opposite of one, then something would be needed to judge the matter. The soul would then be puzzled, would look for an answer, and would stir up its understanding and would ask what the one itself is. And so I just wanted to start with this section, so here we've got this idea that, there is kind of the idea of the form of a finger. It's kind of the universal idea of a finger, but fingers present themselves in various different types of particulars. And so there's that one idea. And then the other idea that Socrates is bringing in here is the idea of calculation and number as being the most important subject that a philosopher can learn. And I just wanted to get some ideas about that. Do we understand, or do we accept, first of all, this idea of the finger as being one type of thing, that there's a universal idea of a finger, but that the finger presents itself in various different ways? And then what do we understand by Socrates' meaning when he says calculation? Is there only one way of interpreting calculation, or are there different ways of interpreting calculation? And so I just wanted to throw it open to that and see what people think. Do we have some thoughts on those two questions, really? Either the universal idea of the oneness of a finger versus its many different particulars, or the idea of calculation. What is meant by calculation? But we'll start with Joel.
Yeah, I'll give this a try, James. It's intuitively appealing to me and I haven't read this before or heard it discussed, that calculation is among the most elemental properties of the soul or of reason. I think the properties of fingers, we might come to a different threshold where we observe, a hand, and we can distinguish a thumb from a baby finger, an index finger, whatever. But we recognize them somehow. They, in an unknown way, we're calculating the differences between these and saying they don't exceed that threshold from which we would no longer consider them a finger like we do with the palm of my hand. And quantity, numbers, are the one element that seem to be the most primary of all the elements, at least to the individual human being. We may get into more complex reasoning in physics and other places, but I find that whole line of questioning intuitively appealing.
Thank you. And certainly you really struck me what you said, Joel, when you said that it's as if there is this threshold beyond which a finger is no longer a finger. And certainly the calculation would allow us to determine where that threshold is. So that particularly struck me. And again, this idea of differences, that I introduced with, and I think you picked up on this idea of we have to determine what the differences are, and calculation would seem to be required for that. Bill, what are your thoughts?
I can't say I understand this completely. I'd have to read it more carefully. But what comes to mind when he talks about calculation is that, to me, the calculation means our ability to discern between different things, to separate. So from oneness, we create multiplicity. And, that's just, I guess that's part of our nature. But there is still, the impression to me is that there is still this oneness that is still there, even though we are perceiving or using our minds to create different forms of this one thing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's what comes to mind.
It does. And this idea of discerning the one from the many, I think, is a key idea, Bill, that you raised. And maybe I'll present, a couple of. I sat down yesterday and tried to think of different ways that we use the word calculate or calculation, and I came up with sort of two different ways that we can use the word. One relates to uncertainty, and the other relates to certainty. So, in the uncertain sense of the word calculate, I came up with two sentences. The first is, before acting, I calculated my chance of success to be greater than failure. And so that's kind of an estimate. And the other sentence was, by my calculation, we should arrive at midnight. And again, that's kind of an estimate of, I calculated that, the time from now until our arrival is going to take us so long. And so that's when I predict our arrival will be. So that's, in the sense of uncertainty, I think that we use the word calculate or calculation. And in the context of certainty, I came up with two different sentences, and they're both mathematical. So in the context of certainty, one sentence is, I calculate the sum or product of these numbers to be, whatever it is. Or I calculated the cube of 2 equals 8. And so those are certain statements. So, we've got this idea of calculation both dealing with certainty and uncertainty. And I'm just wondering, how we relate that to Socrates' sense of time. And it's a sense of time that actually started. I've got an excerpt here in the notes from Timaeus 37d or 37c to 38d, where he talks about time as being sort of split, as I said in the introductory notes, split between the past and the future on one hand, which are in this eternal state of being. There is no becoming. The past and future, they're not subject to change. What is subject to change is the present. And so this present is the state of becoming. So the present is kind of this uncertain state, whereas the past and the future, there is no becoming involved with those. And so calculation seems to cover both of those two different states. If you think of calculation as dealing, sometimes with uncertainty, which is what we deal with in the present, and sometimes with certainty. And I'm just wondering, whether we see that, or whether there's any other definitions of calculation that could apply here. Again, it's something that seems a little bit unusual, from a modern perspective. Philosophers aren't put through school to deal with numbers and calculation necessarily. It doesn't seem to be at least the widespread part of the curriculum. It may be parts of some, but not of any that I know. But here he's saying it is actually the first and most important subject that a philosopher should learn. JK, what's your take on that?
Yeah, it seems like he wants to separate this idea of calculation and certainty, from the uncertainty, of time, the flow, the temporality of changes and so forth. That so the present, is uncertain because it's constantly in a flux, and constant flux of change, of becoming. And so the only certain, so he's trying to establish the certainty of past and future, which is based on one's rational or memory, of course, memory and thought, reason, and aligning that with certainty and calculation. And there is a kind of a sense of certainty in mathematics, because it's it is associated with what is eternal, the past and future, and the unchanging. But is it reasonable to separate that from from our existence in time? And so that's what I think that's what he's proposing, and that that there is this truth of calculation and certainty that can be separated from the flux of time and change.
And thank you for that. It's I think it's very critical to understand to the understanding of what Socrates is trying to say in the Republic and elsewhere. This distinction between being and becoming. You use the word JK flux, and this is maybe something that we face in the present. And so, I just wanted to present this idea, this drawing that I did in the last page of the notes here. That I've got on the screen. And so here on the screen, I drew a line. The line starts at the past and continues onto the future, but the line is broken in the middle by a circle. And in the circle, I placed the present. So I labeled the line that goes into the circle being the past, and the line that comes out of the circle being the future. So these are the same line. But I broke it up by the circle in the middle. And I think this is really what Socrates, or what is described, not by Socrates, but by Timaeus, in Timaeus 37d to 38c. this idea that the past and the future always are, and so they are always being. There is no becoming in the past and the future. The only becoming is in the present. The present is where we have our change, and that's good for us because this is obviously our chance to make our mark on time. And so in the present, this is where we have the visible, for example. In the past and the future are not visible, but the present is visible to us. So the past and the future are only intelligible. And that's what Socrates says, that we require reason to understand the intelligible. The present, we use our sensory inputs to receive information on that. And we saw that in that part that we read, that Socrates uses 3 fingers to demonstrate. So the present, it exists in 3 dimensions of space. They're always rational. They always share one dimension of time. There's always 2 limits of past and future. And they are, as we now know, subject to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And the uncertainty principle says that the more you know of an object's position, the less you know of its momentum, and vice versa. And so inside this circle, inside the circular limit here, we've got this state of becoming, whereas the outside the circle is the state of being. So I just wondered if that kind of depiction is helpful. I've even put, the circle is, as we know, 2 pi. So I put, a pi on the top of the circle and a pi on the bottom. So pi is irrational. And inside the circle, we've got the diameter, which is broken into 2 radii, which are rational. So I'm just wondering whether this particular depiction of time is helpful in understanding this distinction between becoming in the present and eternal being in the past and the future. Bill?
I'm a little bit confused about this because, when you, the sense in the picture is that in this representation, the future and the past are classed as being. The word being, it means that has inherent in it to be. And that to me is that belongs to the present, not the future. The future is not here. So it's not, we're not in it. So we're not, the only time we're being, to me, is in the present. So I'm coming at it the opposite way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. That's just, I understand what you're saying, but I think I see it in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can only live in the present.
Right.
We all do our living in the present every moment. We can live in the past, but that's not very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
We can live in the future. That's not very helpful either, because we're living in the dream world.
Mm-hmm. But
when we're in the present, that's where all our living is done, to me anyway.
And it's an excellent question. I think you're picking up on a question that Jane asked in the last episode, which is this kind of, we seem to have this intuitive sense, perhaps, that the present always is. It just never disappears because we're always in the present. But I think the point here is one that's more particularly related to our understanding of physics. And as I said, in the present, we've got this constant change of action and reaction in equal and opposite measures. And this is Isaac Newton's 3rd law of motion that was, we've known this for about the past 400 years, that in the present, there's always action and action in equal and opposite measures. And we've known for the past close to 100 years, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that we can't know the same amount of information about an object's position and its momentum. The more we know about one, the less we know about the other. So there's always, and I think JK used the word, that there's always this kind of flux in the present, where there's always this change. The physical objects they come to be and they decay. And all of physics eventually winds up in entropy. So we start with physical objects which are in a particular state of order. Like my fingers are in a particular state of order. We know that the molecules in the fingers are atoms, and the atoms are made of electrons and protons and neutrons, and then we know that further can be divided into quarks. But we also know that all of that will eventually be subject to entropy. So all of that order that we see in the physical world tends to disorder. And at the end of time, there's this maximum state of disorder, which is entropy. So physical objects come to be and they pass from being. And Socrates makes that point. And so there's never truly a fixed, permanent state of being in the present. The present is always this changing state, whereas the past and the future are a continuous state. And that's what I've tried to depict here is what is said in Timaeus 37d to 38c. That which is always changeless and motionless cannot become either older or younger in the course of time. Here he's talking about past and future. And then he says, I'll just find the other section there. He says that the past and the future have come to be. It's the present that is always changing. And so the present never reaches a permanent state of being. It's continually changing. So, thank you for that question. Did you want to follow up, Bill, with that?
Yes. Well, I just want to say I can't argue with that because, when we're living in the present, that's where all action is happening, all activity. So, it's just normal to think that, it's hard to argue against where action is happening. It's happening in the present moment, for sure.
And I think this, and I think as I said last time, this is kind of the way I think of time is I'm constantly pulling on a string, and in the middle of the string, there's this bubble that's the present. And then as soon as a present moment is completed, as soon as that cycle of action and reaction is completed, this bubble would disappear and one point would be added to the past, one point would be added to the future, and another bubble would appear. So the present moment never disappears. It continues, but it only has a specific length. It only has a specific duration. So we go from present to present to present to present, but the present is limited. It's restricted to action and reaction in equal and opposite measures, whereas the past and the future are always continuous. There will always be a past. There will always be a future. And I'm wondering if this depiction is helpful in that sense. JK, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think what Bill is referring to is a kind of the subjective experience of existence. So there, from the Socrates point of view, I think, and he's aligning that with the scientific point of view, the objective point of view of. But in reality, nobody experiences, time in the way he's describing it. The future is, we're always projecting ourselves into the future, and we're always dragging the past with us, in our memories. And so, in a sense, and we're not ever in the present. Because once we arrive, we have the sense that we're in the present, we're already, going towards the future, thinking about the future. And so in that sense, it's a subjective experience. And nobody, can get out of that subjective experience. The scientific objective view is to pretend as though this is how it is objectively. But so there, the scientists who are saying that is just imagining that they have no subjectivity of experience. But I think that's what Plato is getting at, that he's trying to think about present, past, and future objectively, rationally, and like somehow get out of your subjectivity and look at yourself in that way, which is not possible or realistic anyway. Yeah.
Well, yeah, really interesting use of words there, JK. The difference between objective and subjective, and certainly when we're in the present, I think, as you said, we're always projecting into the future. I mean, it's what we have to do to survive, right? We can't just remain static. We always have to deal with these changing situations. With this kind of theme of difference that we started, with the introduction of today's episode. This theme of difference. We always have to deal with that difference. And so when you say projecting into the future, I think that's maybe a form of calculation. We're doing these calculations to project what will happen if we take certain actions. And really interesting use of the word subjective, and I think you said, as soon as we think about the future, we're actually changing things in the present, so it's that thought process that changes things in the present. And the thought processes never turn off. So the present is always changing, I guess. And
yeah.
So if I've summarized that correctly.
Yeah. Well, in a sense that, if everything's changing, if you're saying that we're in the process of change, we're never in the present, right? We can never, identify, oh, this is this moment. Okay. I'm right in this moment. Before you even say that, you're already moved beyond that moment that you want to capture. So you can never really be in the moment or the present. You can, generalize and say, okay, well, yeah, well, you're in the present, but you're in. But if you think about it, you are never, because everything's changing. So how could you possibly be in the present of any experience of the moment?
Yeah, I think very much, and certainly the word "be" is the words "be" and "is." Or not Socrates. I keep saying Socrates, but it's Timaeus. Timaeus in the Timaeus keeps saying that the way we use the words "be" and "is" aren't really correct. We say that we are in the present, but I think, JK, as you just said, we're not really. We're not at one static position in the present. We exist in the present, but that present is always changing. It's like maybe that we're standing on a stage, and that stage underneath us is always moving, right? So we're never on a fixed point on the stage. The stage is always moving, but we exist. It's not to say that we don't exist. JB, what are your thoughts on this?
It almost seems like it's the present exists, but we just can't understand it, because the minute, as JK said, the minute we think about it, it's already past. Could this be an issue of understanding? Maybe. I like to think of the past as maybe some giant body of water that's constantly growing, the present more of a faucet that's constantly dripping, and the future really, in my mind, really doesn't exist. The past is there. What's happened has happened. The present is constantly changing, leading me into the future, yes. But it's hard to really understand that, because the minute I think about it, everything is already gone by.
Interesting analogy that you use there, the present being the faucet and the past being the giant ocean. So it's kind of, we're drawing from this ocean of the past and dripping it into the future from moment to moment. I like that. It's certainly this idea of observation having an effect on things. That has been debated in science really since quantum mechanics first came out. I think that's back in maybe first the great debate between the great Copenhagen debate, whether the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics is correct. And that's been going on, I guess, since the 1920s for about 100 years. This strange phenomenon of the observer effect. The instant you observe a quantum process, the observation itself changes the outcome of the process. So that's, I think that's something that's really tying into this. And certainly, the way I see this entire diagram here is that it's really the sum of all probabilities, past, present, and future. We could see it as the sum of all probabilities. And where the probabilities change is in the present. The unchanging parts are in the past and the future. Bill.
Well, I was just going to say that I agree that in the present, things are always changing, and in the past and the future, they're kind of stuck. There's no change going on there. We change the past by thinking, and the future by thinking about it in different ways, which are untrue. We're using our imagination to change the past and the future, but in the present, all we're doing is we're observing. We're observing and responding to what's there. So if we use our reason, then the present is in a way it's the truth of everything. So past and the future are dead and gone, or not yet here. So we can't rely on that very, very well. But in the larger sense, I think there's a certain constancy to the present in the sense that it's always here, even though what's happening inside the present moment is always changing. But as a concept, it's always here. It's always available for us to use and enjoy, while living in the past and present, in the past and the future, is a worthless kind of pursuit.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think, as you say this idea between, or this distinction between the observer and that which is observed. And I think this is an important distinction to make in terms of our understanding of knowledge, is that the observer always needs to be separate and apart from the observed. Yeah. Because if they were mixed up together, then as soon as you would never have an ability to observe anything accurately, because the observation itself would change what's being observed. So the observer and the observed need to be separate in that sense. And so that's an important point to make. But certainly our understanding of our appreciation of what knowledge is, I think we need to understand that difference.
I just want to mention that being in the present doesn't mean we can't plan for the future, because that's all being done in the present anyway.
Absolutely.
So in the present, and also in the present, we can't learn from the past. But to actually be in the past or in the future is not possible. And if you use your mind to try to be in the future, that's also can be lead to falsehoods too, I think.
Right. And Socrates says, as we discussed previously, that it's reason that is used to understand the past and the future. That state of being that exists in the past and the future is accessible by reason. And I think here Socrates is saying that it's calculation that we apply when we apply reason. We use calculation to figure out what to do with that application of reason. So reason is applied around the circle, and then inside the circle is the visible, and that's where the five senses become activated. As Socrates said, it's the senses are summoned by the differences that they see in the present. It's he actually makes this point at 523c. The perceptions that don't summon the understanding are all those that don't go off into opposite perceptions at the same time. But the ones that do go off in that way I call summoners. Whenever sense perception doesn't declare one thing any more than its opposite, no matter what the object striking the senses is, near at hand or far away. And so that's when he says that reason is summoned when we get these different perceptions. And that example that we started off with the fingers, you see a finger, intuitively that it's a finger, but then you start seeing differences. You start seeing differences in the position of the finger, second, third, and fifth finger. You start seeing differences in the softness and hardness, the size of the finger. Some fingers are dark, some fingers are light, some fingers are wrinkly, some fingers are fat, some fingers are short and stubby. All of these differences, that's when reason is summoned into play. And then we start to understand in the present how things came to be like that. And one of my favorite passages in all of Plato is that a passage in the Meno where he says, knowledge is recollection. And he says further, recollection is the account of the reasons why. So what we're recalling is the account of the reasons why. And I think that's maybe why this idea of summoning and calculation of the differences is in the present. We're understanding those differences and we're using those differences to make that account of the reasons why that forms our knowledge. So that's, this is what I wanted to present with this idea, just so that we're kind of clear. I think because if we're not clear on this idea of the difference between being and coming to be, then I think it's difficult to understand what Socrates is trying to say in the Republic and elsewhere. I just wanted to maybe move from this to the idea of the differences in the types of knowledge that the philosopher uses and the guardian uses. So we have, and we didn't really go through the education of the guardian, and I didn't do that for a particular reason, because I think here they're kind of refuting what they said earlier. So we've got the section that we're reading today, which is 521D to 541D, and I've picked out a few sections in here. I've tried to compare them to comparable sections earlier in the Republic. So this is about 100 pages earlier in the Republic, when they talk about the guardians in 376A to 399E. And I've just kind of contrasted the different types of knowledge that the philosopher would use versus what the guardian would use, because I think it's important to understand that they're not, I don't think that they're advocating for the knowledge that they were saying earlier in 376A to 399E. I don't think that they're advocating for this. I think they're changing their position now. When they get to 521D to 541D, which is what we're reading today, it's a different kind of knowledge that they say that the rulers require. And so there's this contrast in the types of knowledge that they're giving the guardians. They're restricting the types of knowledge that the guardians are allowed to have earlier in the Republic. They're saying we will not allow them to think certain things. And they also said earlier in the Republic that the guardians were to be the older people. And here I've just replayed this, and I know Jose has brought this up in the past. So I just thought it would be helpful to have this section here where they talk about the guardians. And this is on this first page of the notes. On the right-hand column, they talk about testing the rulers starting from youth. Testing. I'll actually just read this from 413E to 414B. This is right before they get into that noble lie that we talked about a few episodes ago. They say, like those who lead colts into noise and tumult to see if they're afraid, we must expose our young people to fears and pleasures, testing them more thoroughly than gold is tested by fire. If someone is hard to put under a spell, is apparently gracious in everything, and is a good guardian of himself and the music and poetry he has learned, and if he always shows himself to be rhythmical and harmonious, then he is the best person both for himself and for the city. Anyone who is tested in this way as a child, youth, and an adult, and always comes out of it untainted, is to be made a ruler as well as a guardian. Then isn't it truly most correct to call these people complete guardians, since they will guard against external enemies and internal friends, so that the one will lack the power and the other desire to harm the city? The young people, who we've hitherto called the guardians, will now call auxiliaries and supporters of the guardians' convictions. So that's what they said, about 100 pages earlier, and a couple of episodes earlier in our discussion. But then in this reading today, they actually say that it's wrong. That they're not going to they're not actually going to make the rulers the older people. They say that we actually have to make them the younger people. So they talk about a number of times, for example, at 535a, they say, do you remember what sort of people we chose in our earlier selection of rulers? So there's this earlier selection and there's this later selection. Because I think now they've got to the point where they understand what real knowledge is required. And they're not going to put themselves as the men on the parapet in that analogy or the allegory of the cave that we looked at in our first episode. They're not going to put themselves in that role. And they're not going to project these falsehoods on the wall in front of the prisoner in the cave and make them think that these are that this is truth. In fact, they say now that the philosopher hates falsehoods. So I think they're changing their approach to the type of ruler that's going to be allowed to rule. And in fact, as we saw last episode, they say that the philosopher hates falsehoods. And so I'm just wondering, what people think about this distinction. Did you pick this up as you're reading, today's selection versus what we read, back when we talked about the Guardians the first time? Any thoughts on that? There's one really interesting selection here, which is, let me just pull it up here. Yeah, it's on this page here. It's a comparison of 535e to the earlier part, 389b to c. It's just this last set of boxes here on the screen. So now in today's reading, they're saying similarly with regard to the truth. Won't we say that a soul is maimed if it hates a voluntary falsehood, cannot endure to have one in itself, and is greatly angered when it exists in others, but is nonetheless content to accept an involuntary falsehood, isn't angry when it is caught being ignorant, and bears its lack of understanding easily, wallowing in it like a pig? And compare that to 389b to c when they're talking about the guardians. This is earlier in the reading, and there they say, moreover, we have to be concerned about truth as well. For if what we said just now is correct, and falsehood, though of no use to the gods, is useful to people as a form of drug, clearly we must allow only doctors to use it, not private citizens. Then, if it is appropriate for anyone to use falsehoods for the good of the city, because of the actions of either enemies or citizens, it is the rulers. But everyone else must keep away from them, because for a private citizen to lie to a ruler is just as bad a mistake as a sailor not to tell the captain the facts about his own condition. So there's quite a contrast, I think, that's being set up, and I just wonder if we've picked up on that and what we think about that, and what was their intent in talking about the guardians earlier, if they're now going to turn in a different direction. We'll take JK and then JB.
Yeah, the music and poetry was mentioned as a form of education, for the young, right? But somewhere maybe later, the poets are banished, right? Because of what? Because they're spreading falsehoods or something. So what happens to poetry, after that? Do they take out poetry as a form of education for the young?
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and I've actually got that section that just moved up a few lines here on the screen. I've got that selection again from the Guardians when they were talking about 380b to c. We won't allow poets to say that the punished are made wretched and that it was a god who made them so, but we will allow them to say that bad people are wretched because they are in need of punishment, and that in paying the penalty they are benefited by the gods. And as for saying that a god who is himself good is the cause of bad things, we'll fight that in every way. And we won't allow anyone to say it in his own city, if it's to be well governed, or anyone to hear it either, whether young or old, whether in verse or prose. These stories are not pious, not advantageous to us, and not consistent with one another. And so here I think they were severely limiting the knowledge that the guardians were allowed to use. And now in the later passages, they're saying, well, maybe the philosopher is really the best one to be equipped to actually think for himself and to establish his own limits of knowledge. So earlier they were kind of like the men on the parapet, limiting the amount of knowledge that the prisoner on the cave was allowed to see on that on the projections on the wall. And now they're saying, well, that's really not the way that things should be run. JB, your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm struck by the last sentence in 509A. Both knowledge and truth are beautiful things, but the good is other and more beautiful than they. And I would assume Socrates feels that the guardians having a separate education, or the falsehoods, the noble falsehoods for the guardians, would be part of the good. I'm also struck by how that's another form of calculation, that knowledge and truth are beautiful, but the good is more beautiful than that.
Interesting point. Yeah, that hadn't occurred to me actually until you just said it, that this idea of greater and less degrees of beauty. You certainly called out that very important section, I think, where Socrates gives this definition of the good. So that which gives truth to the things that are known. So that which gives truth to the things that are known, and the power to know to the knower is the form of the good. And that's something that I think we need to keep remembering about in the Republic. Bill.
I think Socrates here is giving all the power to the philosophers, assuming that they'll always be good and correct and truthful. But is that being realistic? People are, we're corruptible in some sense, or we're prone to untruths from time to time because of lack of knowledge, or just our emotions are carrying us away. So I think it can be a little bit problematic if we give the power to all the power to philosopher kings. I think it might be a little bit better to educate as many people in the population as we can to become wise, so we can put checks and balances on ourselves, on each other.
Very good point. I mean, and I think we'll see what others think about this, but I think in the section that we read 2 weeks ago, Socrates made the point that we have to be very careful with philosophers, because even though they can be very good, they're also subject to the greatest of corruption. And he said that. And so because these are powerful people, they are actually able to distinguish, these differences in knowledge. But if they become corrupted, the power that they have of perception and of use of reason can very well be easily used for evil purposes. And so I don't think he's saying that the philosopher is the panacea, that will find a philosopher who will always be good. I think he's saying we have to be very careful to make sure that, as perhaps you said, that there are these kinds of checks and balances, and that people don't fall under the spell of a charlatan or a fraud. So it's a very good point. JK.
Yeah, I think he's trying to, establish what kind of person should have this kind of power. And I think he distinguishes the people who are poor in spirit, because of their lack of philosophy. And I think he sees philosophers as as being rich in spirit, because they're concerned with the truth, with knowledge, and so they have no need for power for the sake, power for power's sake. They're in it. They're not in it for that. They're in it because that's not what they're interested in. They're interested in the truth, or in the spirit of philosophizing, and so I think he's correct in that sense that they're less prone to be corrupted because of that. Because if you have other people who lack that kind of interest or love of philosophy of truth, and then they would be much more likely to be corrupted. So I think that's I kind of agree with that. That's a very that's a good standard to go by. You look at our, I guess you look at our present situation with politicians. They come from all backgrounds. Business people, small business owners, and things like that, and they're basically not in it for any high ideals of public service, right? They're in it for something else.
And you really call out right at the beginning of today's reading at 521b, Socrates says, "Can you name any life that despises political rule or besides that of the true philosopher?" And then he says, "But surely it is those who are not lovers of ruling who must rule. For if they don't, the lovers of it, who are rivals, will fight over it." And I think that's essentially what you just pointed out. That this is what happens when people become lovers of ruling rather than lovers of knowledge. And when we first started talking about the Republic 5 episodes ago, we looked at the allegory of the cave, and the allegory of the cave, when the prisoner saw the light, when he was able to make his way out of the cave, what happened? They forced him back. So once he saw the light, he had the knowledge, and he was forced back. He didn't want to go back into that dark cave where it was full of falsehoods, but he was forced back because he now had the knowledge, and it was his responsibility then with that knowledge to go back and lead the others to knowledge. And maybe that's a little bit of the checks and balances that Bill was talking about earlier. JB.
So do we assume that the philosophers themselves won't fight over the truth, over their passion for the truth? Someone who is dedicated to civic service could feel that this is the best way our people should go, or this is the next person could have a completely different idea, and both genuine, both truly dedicated to public service. But I still can imagine there would be conflict there as well, and maybe get just as nasty as the businessmen who currently rule.
I think a very good point. And certainly the section that we didn't cover, where they talk about the 4 different types of rule, including democracy, including tyranny, timocracy. Those different types of rule. I think they're trying to set out the human tendencies towards certain types of behavior, and I think that there can't be an assumption that the philosopher is always, or that philosophers will always agree among themselves about the truth. And so there would be likely conflicts, as you stated. But I think, the ideal is that the true philosopher will understand that there are sometimes differences, and then will understand also how to deal with differences in a way that's productive and not destructive. So it's a good question, and I wonder what others think about that. But I think that's certainly, we have to get to the level of the philosopher, perhaps, to even get to that sort of potential. JK?
Well, yeah. Well, the word philosophy means the love of knowledge, right? So even though they might have different philosophies, first might have different positions or ideas of what what true knowledge should be or is, or how things should be. They're still interested in knowledge and in wisdom and learning, and so even if there's conflict, they will still be philosophers in arguing about what is truth and so forth, and not for the sake of power, right? So So of course, there's a, you're going to have, maybe some philosophers that believe that there's, the philosophy of Machiavelli or the philosophy of Hobbes or something like that. But at least if they're really philosophers, they also understand the other positions, right? And acknowledge that those other philosophical positions are also might be more truthful, or right. So it would be a conflict among people in the in the area of concern for knowledge and truth, and as opposed to a democracy where anybody can run for office, right, and be elected by a group of people who have who are interested just in power for power's sake, or for monetary interests and things like that, and to have no interest or tendency to understand or care for the truth, or not knowledge of the truth.
Interesting. They use the idea of these philosophical differences. So one philosopher, you used Hobbes as an example, might have one particular way of approaching things. Other philosophers like Machiavelli will have a different way of approaching things. And so maybe, as you said, the true philosopher will be the one who tries to reconcile these different philosophical approaches. And maybe instead of focusing on the differences, differences kind of today's theme maybe in our discussion, instead of focusing on the differences, the true philosopher will try to reconcile and find the common elements and the common threads to tie them together. So it's an interesting point. Jose?
Now we have to remember that here Socrates is trying to design an ideal city and an ideal form of government. So now the philosophers, to be rulers, remember that they have to be like after they are 50 years old, they have almost like 40 years of instruction and several selections. So Socrates envisioned a way that practically the people that get there, they will be almost perfect, incorruptible, and they don't want material things, only knowledge. Now, the thing of disagreement among the philosophers, remember that well, we didn't cover yet, but the importance of the dialectic. And the dialectic is exactly that. Dialectic is to get to the truth by dialogue, but by conversation. So at the end, the philosophers, they cannot disagree. They disagree, but they go into dialectic and they get the best. So I think Socrates has all the things thought, all these kind of things. So they cannot be struggles because different of ideas. It's not. Using dialectic, when you have different ideas, you get to the truth.
Definitely, yes. And dialectic is an important section of today's reading, and so I think you've raised it, and it's something that I think we can discuss now. Is this idea of dialectic and what exactly is dialectic? And so, yeah, and I just wanted to again call to attention 536D in today's reading, where they say, let's not forget that in our earlier selection, when they're talking about the guardians, we chose older people, but that isn't permitted in this one. In other words, the philosophers, for we mustn't believe Solon when he says that as someone grows older, he's able to learn a lot. He can do that even less well than he can run races, for all great and numerous labors belong to the young. So I guess maybe he's throwing the old people like me under the bus in that, but I think there's this change in the earlier section. They said the auxiliaries were going to be the young and the rulers were going to be the old, and now they're taking this different kind of tactic to say that it's really the young who have to be trained to be the rulers. So anyway, for those of us who are of a certain age, I guess it it may not be the best news to hear, but it's certainly an interesting turn. So maybe just look at this section on the dialectic here that I've got on the screen, 533a to 534a, and this idea that where Socrates says, and I've underlined here, dialectic is the only inquiry that travels this road, doing away with hypotheses and proceeding to the first principle itself so as to be secure. And I think this goes back to the discussion that we started today's session on this distinction between being and becoming. So in the world of becoming, which is the present, that uncertain physical state, we make all sorts of hypotheses, and we perhaps use calculation to make hypotheses, to make estimates and guesses. But he's saying we have to use dialectic, which is really, more in the power of reason than in this making hypotheses and testing hypotheses, and using the power of reason to actually find the first principle that we're trying to work according to. And they're saying, so mustn't we insist that the power of dialectic could reveal it only to someone experienced in the subjects we've described, and that it cannot reveal it in any other way? So we'll talk about the different subjects that a philosopher will be expected to learn, or at least according to the discussion and the dialogue. But maybe talk first about this idea of dialectic and disposing with hypotheses and going directly to the first principles. Jose?
Well, no, I wanted to, this thing that you mentioned about, just before talking about dialectic, about the older people. Remember that he's talking about forming the people. So he doesn't want to start with all people to the education. Remember that at the end of the book, in the very last paragraph, I think, he says that he's asking how do we form the ideal city? He said, okay, we go there and we banish everybody older than 10 years old, and we grab the youngest and we start educating them. So that's the pretty radical like approach. So the education has to start, the forming has to start from like 10 years old. Mm-hmm. No more than that. Mm-hmm. But to be rulers, so the selection, the auxiliaries, I think when they are 20 years old, they decide who is going to be auxiliary and who is not. And after that, after like 15 years, 5 years of mathematics and 5 years of dialectics and 15 years in service. So when they are 50, they just can start being rulers. Anyway. So
yeah, certainly the education has to start young, and can't wait until
10 years old.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a pretty radical suggestion that they make at the end of the book, as you say, and we'll look forward to talking about that in 2 weeks' time. It's a very interesting approach. So I did this. I did this kind of diagram here on the screen based on what Socrates says in this second section, like around 534a or 533e. He says, and when the eye of the soul is really buried in a sort of barbaric bog, dialectic gently pulls it out and leads it upwards, using the crafts we described to help it and cooperate with it in turning the soul around. From force of habit, we've often called these crafts sciences or kinds of knowledge, but they need another name, clearer than opinion, darker than knowledge. We called them thought somewhere before. But I presume that we won't dispute about a name when we have so many more important matters to investigate. It will therefore be enough to call the first section knowledge, the second thought, the third belief, and the fourth imaging, just as we did before. The last two together we call opinion, the other two intellect. And so this is this diagram that I've done here, just in two boxes. So the first box is knowledge and thought. They relate to intellect, which is what is used to understand the realm of being. And then the second two are belief and images, which are based on the senses. And these generate opinion, which is used in the realm of becoming. And then he goes on to say that, and as being is to becoming, so intellect is to opinion. And as intellect is to opinion, so knowledge is to belief and thought to imaging. But as for the ratios between the things, these are set over, and the division of either the opinable or the intelligible section into two, let's pass them by, Glaucon, lest they involve us in arguments many times longer than the ones we've already gone through. So he makes specific reference to ratios, which again is that idea of numbering calculation, which he says is the first order of business for a philosopher to learn. And I just wonder what people think about this distinction, this idea that knowledge and thought belong to the realm of the eternal being, which is where we use intellect and reason, and belief. We base our belief on the sensory images that we receive, and that forms our opinion, which is used in the realm of becoming, but is not really related to that eternal realm of being. I just thought it was an interesting way of presenting this idea of dialectic, and this idea of trying to look for the first principles in things. Again, maybe it relates a little bit to that section in Meno that I mentioned earlier. The idea that knowledge is the account of the reasons why, and if we're going to make that account, maybe we need to understand the different combinations of information that we receive and the different ways that we can apply our intellect to the information that we receive. Bill, and then Joel, and then James.
Well, yeah, this struck me as quite interesting because, we often, including myself, confuse knowledge and belief. We take belief for knowledge, or we supplant knowledge with belief, thinking it is knowledge. So, dialectic is a way of threading through that and separating those two, and coming up with the truth. So, yes, I understand this. I think it's a personal failing at times, and it needs to be corrected.
Certainly, the idea of distinguishing knowledge from belief and opinion is key, and I think it's something maybe that confuses a lot of people, and we see that confusion a lot nowadays, maybe. And so, we need to maybe decrease that confusion, and so dialectic here is provided as the way of doing that. Joel, your thoughts?
Yeah, I find this also very interesting, but perhaps for a slightly different reason. I think that knowledge is what, to use an accounting phrase, generally accepted belief and image. So what we take for knowledge is merely beliefs and images that we have absorbed and accept as true. And it's very difficult to change knowledge, but beliefs and images are much more fluid. Knowledge, however, can be changed through sufficient thought. So there's a constant cycle between these four images: belief, knowledge, and thought. And this really almost goes back to what is the present. In a particular instant, thought may overwhelm knowledge, almost like rock, paper, scissors, if you like. It's to use an infantile image, but they are all related and constantly evolving, in my opinion. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And your use of the term generally accepted, of course, resonates in me as an accountant. And I think somewhere, and I was just looking for the reference, Socrates uses the term the mob. So when you think that knowledge is the same as what the mob thinks it is, in other words, the crowds of people, then maybe that's clouding what knowledge actually is. So we have to, because it's easy to confuse people perhaps with opinion, because there's so many ways now that opinion can be disseminated, and the more people see it, the more they're led to believe that it's true, when in fact it may just be opinion. And so are they provided with the tools that they need to actually distinguish what is generally accepted from what is actually true? So it was an interesting way of putting it. Thank you. And we'll go to James and Jose and Bill. James.
Yeah, I think this is a very idealized version of the world that Plato has here. Normally, in modern times, we think of probability as being the greater way to approach knowledge. We used to have beliefs, for example, that the sun was the center of the universe. Okay, then we got, and we would have considered that to be knowledge. We would have considered that to be knowledge, but now that we have greater astronomical information, we know that the sun is not the center of the universe. And so I want to suggest that this vision that Plato has of images at the bottom, followed by belief with more certainty, followed by thought with more certainty yet, coming to knowledge, which is somehow certain, is an illusion. I don't think we have certainty. As Bertrand Russell once said, the only certainty is uncertainty. I think a more practical way would be to say we have higher levels of probability in what we believe to be true, whereas Plato kind of lived in a in a right and wrong world where he thought there was a eternal heaven in which the Platonic forms resided, and then there was a universe of opinion in which we basically let our senses reign. I'm interested in the topic of ratios, however. What kind of ratio do we get as we try to show the relationship between opinion and intellect? And I'm interested to hear more about that. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, it's a good question, and you make a good point, about this. Is this a scale of certainty that we're going up? We're using probabilities, and we're going from lesser certainty about the probabilities of something up to a greater certainty. And what does he mean by ratios here exactly? It's a good question. And I wonder, just add to what you said, the fact that he's grouped things together. So he hasn't put it as an exact scale of 1, 2, 3, 4 like this. He's grouped 1 and 2 together, and he's grouped 3 and 4 together. So belief and images are grouped together, and knowledge and thought are grouped together. So I'm wondering whether this grouping is maybe a way of dealing with that uncertainty that you mentioned. It's a good point that you brought up, though, in terms of, can there be that scale of certainty and you get up to a certain knowledge, or is knowledge always grouped with something that is a little bit less certain, such as thought? And so maybe it's these groupings that's important. But let's see what others think about that. It's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go to Jose and Bill.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I think here this graphic that you mentioned is that we put this belief and images and opinion in one side and intellect, knowledge, and thought in the other, is exactly what he was doing with the allegory of the cave. Remember that the prisoners at the beginning, they were chained, and the only thing that they saw they were images. So they considered the world, the truth, and everything was images. And after that, when the prisoner was free, he saw the fire, and he saw the like the statues and what happened inside the cave. So he's in the stage of belief, but because even the things that he sees, they are not the real things, because he's still inside the cave. He's in another stage. So now he gets out of the cave. So this is the stage of thought. I think maybe when he's still seeing reflections, and knowledge when he see the sun and the real forms and everything. And so this is one thing. This is the way that he see. Another thing that we're talking about, like the sun rotating against the sun rotates to the earth, etc., etc. Remember, I think this is my opinion. We can debate about that, but I think for Plato, remember that Plato, he didn't like very much astronomy as a thing for knowledge. I think for knowledge, he's looking more at eternal truth. I think it's more like ethical things, the concept of justice, the concept of beauty, etc. That they are I think for him, they think they won't change. Doesn't matter whatever you discover, the theory of relativity or whatever. The thing won't change. So it's not like astronomy or physical things that they can change. The knowledge for him, I think, is more like this eternal truth.
Well, thanks for that reminder about the allegory of the cave and that kind of progression I think you were talking about from the images to belief, that combination, and then that was illuminated, maybe with the simile of the sun that we talked about when we did that episode. So there was that illumination that was brought on into it, and then belief and image kind of progressed to knowledge and thought. But I think what you're talking about is maybe that kind of progression.
Yes, and another thing that I think I forgot to mention. I think in thought, for example, when he's talking about the teaching of mathematics, is just below knowledge. So mathematics, I think, is belong to that area, thought, because it will help with the knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And certainly, I mean, I think mathematics and geometry, which is the second level of knowledge that he recommends, both of those are subject to certainty, right? You can say with certainty that 2 times 2 equals 4, or 2 squared equals 4, or 2 plus 2 equals 4. You can say with certainty that those relationships exist. Whereas, as you pointed out, ethics, for example, is subject to all sorts of uncertainty. The question of justice is subject to all sorts of uncertainty. And so, maybe we need to, as he says, deal with or learn knowledge that leads us to certainty first, and then we can start to deal with uncertainty. And so maybe that's why he puts number and calculation as the first level of certainty. And he's pretty categorical about that, actually. He says, and this is at the beginning of the reading at 522c, he says, isn't it true that every craft in science must have a share in number and calculation? Every craft in science must have a share in number and calculation. So he's pretty categorical. He doesn't leave any room for doubt in that. So maybe that is that question of learning the most certain knowledge first, and then you can progress to the less certain things, as you put it. So thank you. Bill.
Yes, well, I appreciate what James said about this model, in the sense that it's idealized, and so knowledge. What is knowledge, and how do we get it? Well, it seems to me that it comes from seeing what is apparent to you, what is visible, what is seen, and what is not seen as well. So in the sense, and experience as well. But we need the intellect, we need the thought, the mind to parse that information. And so the two go together. You can't, knowledge by itself could be false. In the cave allegory, it's what they see is not correct, is false, right? But if one thought of used your mind you could say to yourself, well, what is it that I'm not seeing that may change my perception, the truth of the matter?
Very powerful point, actually, that you make there. You know, this idea that what is not seen can sometimes be more important than what is seen.
Mm.
And I think that's something that, you know, is we can easily become confused about, because we want to. I mean, the light is the thing that travels fastest in the universe, so it's a thing that reaches our eyes first, and we want to believe what we see, right? But I think there are ways that perception can be distorted, and certainly we saw that in the allegory of the cave. We can see it too and I'm thinking about Marshall McLuhan, who talked about, this was in the Gutenberg Galaxy, where he wrote about the introduction of television at the time. He wrote it in 1962, I think. So his television was fairly new, and he was talking about the problem with a two-dimensional screen is that it doesn't let you see depth from a natural perspective. It allows you to see depth from the perspective of the person who has actually filmed the image. And so he makes the point that if an image is filmed, for example, if you have a gathering of people, say there's a protest, and there's maybe 20 people protesting. They've got their signs up and they're yelling and all of that. So the camera might take an image of that group from below, and that image, because it's from below, it would fill the screen with all of those people. And there's only 20 people at the protest, for example, but it would make it seem as if the protest is very large because of the angle from which the shot is taken. Whereas if you had a shot from above, you would see that it was a very small gathering in relation to the space around it. And I think that's actually something that may be practiced a lot now. That kind of distortion is practiced a lot now to make the event seem like the depth of the event seem as something that it is not otherwise. And that can be done, with a particular political perspective, for example. So I found that was a very powerful example in that kind of two-dimensional understanding where the third dimension of depth is not our own. It's not natural. It's put there by the person who's taken the image. And that's maybe actually something that maybe we'll just go and look at the order of knowledge that Socrates and Glaucon discuss here. And this is from 522b to 528e. And here Socrates actually uses the term, going from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. And so what I tried to do was put these subjects that they talk about in order. So they say first, number and calculation, as we've seen, is the first order of business for a philosopher to learn. The second order of business, they say, is plane geometry. Then the third is solid geometry. And the fourth is astronomy. And what I tried to do is set out in this table the different dimensions that these subjects deal with, and then also the types of knowledge provided. So number and calculation, I've indicated one dimension, and that's just thinking about the dimensionality of number, considering that from the perspective of the infinite density of the real line. So we, in the early 1800s. The three-dimensional concept of math and geometry was introduced, and the real line is introduced, and that's when the imaginary or lateral numbers were introduced. But when we think of number itself, number is the real line, and that is infinitely dense. And so I put it as one dimension. So maybe that's kind of the idea of the first principle, is that number and calculation gives us that single dimension of knowledge. And the type of knowledge I indicated here, I think that they're talking about, is the knowledge of equality and inequality. And then so from there, they go to plane geometry. That's the second order of knowledge that the philosopher needs to know. And that would deal with 2 dimensions, length and width. So that's how you get a plane figure, whether it's a triangle or a square or whatever the other plane figures are. There's an infinite number of them, I guess. but that deals with 2 dimensions, and that gives you a sense of both difference and shape. So we go from one dimension, which has no shape, to shape, which is where we get plane geometry. And then from there, we go to solid geometry, which Socrates says is the third order of business. And so solid geometry takes the shape that we got in the second dimension of plane geometry, and it puts it into 3 dimensions. It gives us depth. So instead of just length and width, we now have depth. And then the fourth order of business, he says, is astronomy. And so the astronomy takes depth and gives it motion. So I thought this was kind of an interesting progression of these different levels of knowledge. And I'm wondering what everyone thinks about that. I mean, if we accept, and I don't know if we accept, but if we accept numbering calculation as the first level of knowledge, does this progression seem to make sense in understanding the changing world that is around us, the changing world of the present that is around us? Does this progression seem to make some sense? Jose.
Well, just one point is that Plato, a difference with Aristotle, he kind of dismissed things that we need observation to get knowledge. So he thinks that everything has to be in the abstract level. I don't know how to explain. This is why when they were talking about astronomy, and they say, I like something like, I like astronomy, but not by observation, just by deduction. And he's talking more about, I think, metaphysics or cosmology than astronomy. So he wants to study all the things from the theoretical point of view. He said that geometry is okay. We need that geometry for military purposes or but in reality, for him, is the theoretical, no observation. It's as opposite to, this is a big difference with Aristotle, because Aristotle, he says that science starts by observation. Anyway, that's a point that.
And thank you for raising that difference. It's an important one, and I'd like to discuss that actually. If anyone else is interested in discussing that point that Jose just raised, is all knowledge perception? Is the only knowledge that we can have that which we receive with our 5 senses, or I think, as Plato is saying, does knowledge come to us by way of reason? Which is from the use of dialectic, and reason can transcend what we perceive with our 5 senses. I think that's a very important distinction to make, because things that we see or we think that we know from observation, such as that long period of human history when we thought that the sun revolved around the earth. Until we discovered that it was not that way. Is observation subject to error? And that was a significant error. I mean, it was an error that led, for example, Galileo to be subject to the Inquisition, and prohibited from writing because he thought that he was implying that what they thought to be reality was actually not reality. It's an important point. So that, I mean, if we want to explore that, it'd be great. And otherwise, if anybody else has any other ideas, please bring them forward. We've got about 20 minutes left, and we'll go to Bill and then JK.
I was thinking about the James Pack's example of the flat Earth. Well, that was it was seen in a 2-dimensional way, in the sense so that the technology wasn't really available to everyone to see the Earth, see the curvature of the Earth, which would imply the 3rd dimension. Because if you're looking at the Earth, looking at the field, it appears to be the Earth is actually 2-dimensional. But if you go into a little bit higher into the atmosphere, you'll quickly see the curvature. So, you can't blame people for accepting that was the case, but you can question why they refused to accept the truth when it was available through science, which they did for many years. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a good example, actually. I like that. They kind of, intuitively you might think that the Earth is flat, but then the technology develops so that you can go into space and you can see that it's not flat. Maybe similar with astronomy. A lot of astronomy is radio astronomy, for example, where they use microwaves. So they're not actually seeing these objects that are, 13 billion years into the past. They're actually just picking up reflections of radio waves or microwaves from those things. So is the technology really there to really truly see what these things are like, or are inferences still being made?
Yes.
It's a good example of technology and how it changes our perception of things. Certainly Galileo, was one of the first to use telescopes. And that was a technology that brought some very new information to enlighten, the ideas that were previously held. JK, your thoughts?
Yeah, it seems like we have, two ways of knowing knowing existence and based on our perception, and based on our knowledge. And like, for instance, the sun, we still, say the sun rises and falls, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the actual fact is that the sun does not do that, rise and fall. It goes around, right? So, but we still use the language of that based on our perception, which goes back, thousands of years. When they start doing that, we still have maintained that kind of sense, and we like to say we experience the Earth as flat, but we know that it's not, right?
Mm.
But so a lot of what we think that we know as knowledge is false, all right? And we kind of know it's false, but then we still use the language to describe what is false as though it was true. But yeah, so there is a sense that we have knowledge of things that we don't perceive. Like that we have this understanding of quantum physics that's based on calculation and so forth. And but when we you mentioned the observer effect, then it kind of like disproves what we thought we knew, right? So there's a kind of duality there between what we know based on perception and what we know based on what reason, calculation, mathematics, geometry and so forth, astronomy. Yeah. So there is so which one is certain? Right? Definitely we feel certain about our experiences of what's present in our existence, but we also can't deny the certainty of knowledge, like the Earth is not flat, or the sun does not rise or fall, and the number of planets in the universe and so forth. So we don't really see those, but we have a knowledge of those, and we feel certain about that too.
And I think you call an important point that we need to know the limits of our knowledge. We need to know what we don't know, and to say that we are certain about something, we have to be very careful when we say that we're certain about something, don't we? Because history proves that things can change, and new knowledge comes along, and what we thought was certain is in fact not certain. So I guess acknowledging that we don't know is sometimes more important than acknowledging what we do know. So thanks for that. And Moshe?
Hold on just a second. really technologically challenged today.
No worries. All
Okay, I got it.
Okay, there.
Now,
okay.
Okay. Let's start out with these. Your subjects of number and calculation, plane geometry, solid geometry, and astronomy. I just want to make mention that after he discusses that, he says at 5:30 A or B, something like that. Then I said, in astronomy, as in geometry, we should employ problems and let the heavens alone if we would approach the subject in the right way, and so make the natural gift of reason to be of any real use. And then he goes on to, he's saying that there are problems and limits with astronomy. And then he goes on to talk about motion and talking about problems with that. And then he talks about the relativity of the ears. And he concludes all these things by saying that none of these things give us real knowledge. And that goes back to the example that you were giving a couple of slides up that was very reminiscent to me of the allegory of the divided line. Okay. In the divided line, he's got reason, intellect, perception, opinion, or something like that, and all of those things are reaching toward what the Platonic ideal is. Because if we remember where Plato is coming from, he has this idea that reality is indivisible, true, absolute, unchanging, and therefore, if we're going to we'll never be able to perceive those things. We can only know those things by the mind. Nevertheless, we want to train the mind, train the individual to come to the acquisition of this knowledge, and we do that by introducing mathematics. And in our mathematics, we talk about number and calculation and plane geometry and solid geometry and so on, until we get down, and then we introduce all the problems with that, and it ends with Glaucon trying to say that then a mathematician, he's going to be, he's going to know, be the closest to a dialectician. And at the end of 531, he says, "What do you mean?" I said, Socrates speaking. The prelude or what? Do you not know that all this is but the prelude to the actual strain which we have to learn? For you assuredly would not regard the skilled mathematician as a dialectician, because he goes on to say, assuredly not, for one of you know a mathematician to be capable of reason. Then Socrates continues, and so Glaucon, I said, we have at last arrived at the hymn of dialectic. And just to skip a little bit, and so with dialectic, when the person starts on the discovery of the absolute by the light of reason only, without any assistance of sense, and preserves until by intelligence he arrives at the perception of the absolute good. And perception in this case does not mean visual perception, but Plato is a realist at this point, thinking that the mind has direct access to the forms. The perception of the absolute good, he at least finds himself at the end of the intellectual world, as in the case of the sight at the end of the visible. Okay, so that's the one thing I want to say about this progression that we want to bring that we want to bring our leaders through in order to be able to be in the position to have the knowledge and the tools dialectic in order to be a good leader. Then he talks about the divisions of knowledge my greatest line here is that, whatever we say about the conception of good, it has to run the gauntlet of all objections. That brings me back to what you were talking about earlier with Solon. Okay. And this is at the bottom of 536. Socrates says, "But I, who am indeed the teacher, felt that I was. And now let me remind you that although in your former selection you chose old men, we must not now do so in this." Solon was under the delusion that when he said that a man, when he grows old, may learn many things, for he can no more learn much than he can run much. Youth is the time for any extraordinary toil. But when Socrates says that an old man cannot learn, is as limited in his learning as he is in his running, it doesn't follow from that because an older person can't run much, that he can't run a little. Okay? And the same thing with his learning. He might not be able to have encyclopedic knowledge, but he might have dialectical knowledge. And that's what you want. And then the argument, goes on about what it's like when you're, well, let's take a 20-year-old and we'll start to teach him things. And well, there are problems, with, what kids can do and what can learn, what they can learn. And it says, okay, not 20, but how about 30? Okay, well, 30 will go along and we'll get, higher learning, and they can start to learn the dialectic. But there's a problem when they, when they're 30, they become intoxicated with all these things, and so they skip 15 years into 45, about that age, and they give the warning of the person who learns dialectic that he may become a sophist. Okay, for he says at 239, halfway through, and when they have made many conquests and received defeats at the hands of many, they violently and speedily get into a way of not believing anything which they believed before. So anything that we've taught them before, they're at a position now through the dialectic, they've been beat up back and forth, they don't believe anything. And hence, not only they, but philosophy and all that relates to it is apt to have a bad name with the rest of the world. And we know that type of philosophy which has a bad name with the rest of the world is sophistry. So then down at the beginning of 240, Socrates continues, 50 years, I answered. And when they have reached 50 years of age, okay, then let those who still survive and have distinguished themselves in every actions of their lives. So these are the old farts, perhaps, maybe James, your age, okay? Because I'm way past that. But, people at your age, now if you do survive and learn the dialectic and you've distinguished yourself in every action of your lives and in every branch of knowledge, come at last to their consummation. The time has now come when they have arrived at the eye of the soul to the universal light that lightens all things. And they have learned in that the dialectic, and they have learned in that how to learn. So I just want to summarize that all of these pieces of knowledge that we have that are in some way empirical or based upon perception, Socrates in this particular section is arguing against. And he's also saying that we have to challenge the old idea that Glaucon had at the beginning or earlier in the Republic to say, well, it's the older people, obviously, they're going to be the best statesmen. And Socrates said, well, maybe not. Solon tells us that, if you're just an old cracker, you might not be able to do anything. But then Socrates goes on to show how, yeah, that's true. But some of the old geezers, James, I think you're part of this, and some of the other younger members in the class can really accelerate in some of the things that we need for statesmanship. And they will come in their 50s to the age of the consummation of their knowledge when they've really learned the dialectic and we really learned the principles of philosophy. I just want to remind everybody that after he talks about Socrates talks about the problems with with astronomy, he starts talking about industry, the love of truth, and the knowledge of morals. That's the person who we want to have as our statesman. That's going to be the true philosopher. And as I read to my wife last night, the last on the last page, yes, I said Glaucon. Glaucon had said, these men must be our governors. Yes, I said Glaucon, and for our governesses too. For you must not suppose that what I have been saying applies to men only, and not to women, as far as their natures go. There you are right, Glaucon says, since we have made them to share in all things like the men. So that's I'm off my soapbox now, but I wanted to point that out.
Thank you, and that's a very good point. That women are not excluded from this, and that's something that's very, given the time, I guess that's something maybe that's a little bit surprising and good. Because I think, as you said, it's all about the training of the mind, and the training of the mind starts at an early age, and then once the mind is trained, as you said, I think Moshe, I like the word prelude that you used. Near the beginning of what you were talking about is that once the mind is trained to apply reason, for example, with the subjects in the order that they've set them, then it's capable of actually governing. And so it's an interesting. I think it was a good summary that you gave, and appreciate that ending part too. That it includes everybody. It is not excluding women. It's not excluding the old. It's not excluding the young. But it starts at a young age. So thank you for that. We've just got a few minutes left, and so we'll go to Jose, and then maybe we'll wrap it up after that. Jose.
Yeah. Well, one point that it wasn't mentioned, and that is in the education. Like education, we have two things. First of all, he emphasized the thing that we cannot force education in the children. So this is the old saying that the good teacher is the one that not give facts to the students, give the love of the subject. So when they love the subject, they don't have to teach. And another thing is that the way to get the knowledge is kind of, he's saying that you should teach only the concepts, basically, not the facts. It's like the old idea that in the old days that they teach you the multiplication table and you have to memorize them, but they didn't explain you what is the rationale of it. So it's better to teach the rationale because you'll never forget. And this is exactly what Plato is saying. And another thing that I mentioned before, and now with Moshe's exposition, this is that when we talk about Plato, the meaning of him to have knowledge of something, it means it's knowledge that cannot change. So any knowledge, the classic example is astronomy. You observe the things and you think, oh, okay, I have knowledge. Okay, the way that the sun moves around the earth or whatever. This is not knowledge because it's based on observation. He thinks that only the eternal thing, the thing that won't change, this is the kind of knowledge that you have, that it will be eternal. The concept of justice, concept of beauty, etc., that it will never change, whatever you discover.
And thank you for reminding of that part where he says, and I was just looking for the passage, it's in here somewhere, where he says that you can't force someone to learn something because the soul doesn't retain what is forced. In other words, if you tie a prisoner up in the cave, force him to look at the wall, he's not going to remember what he sees on the wall as much as if he learned it internally. And I think the example used is that, you teach children using games, for example, so that they establish internally that sense of relationship between cause and effect, perhaps. But definitely that's a good point, that you can't, that forced knowledge is not as good as knowledge that's discovered through the self. And I think that's an important point. And so maybe just wanted to end with this short bit here. And this is where they're talking about astronomy, but it's also talking about looking up. But Moshe, did you want to say something before I?
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's at the bottom of 536. Socrates says, "But a free man ought not to be a slave in the acquisition of knowledge of any kind. Bodily exercise, when compulsory, does no harm to the body, but knowledge which is acquired under compulsion obtains no hold on the mind."
Thank you. Yeah, that's at the bottom of 536. He said, so that's a very good point, and I think that's maybe what you were talking about before, Moshe. That this is the whole prelude to getting the mind trained. Is to engage it in this way so that it retains the knowledge. So maybe just wrap up with this sort of last section from, it's around 529b or 529a and b, where Socrates, this is where they talk about astronomy. Socrates says, "It may be obvious to everyone except me, but that's not my view about it. As it's practiced today by those who teach philosophy, it makes the soul look very much downward." He's talking about the astronomy here. "In my opinion, your conception of higher studies is a good deal too generous. For if someone were to study something by leaning his head back and studying ornaments on a ceiling, it looks as though you'd say he's studying not with his eyes, but with his understanding. Perhaps you're right, and I'm foolish, but I can't conceive of any subject making the soul look upward except one concerned with that which is, and that which is invisible. If anyone attempts to learn something about sensible things, whether by gaping upward or squinting downward, I'd claim, since there's no knowledge of such things, that he never learns anything, and that even if he studies lying on his back on the ground or floating on it in the sea, his soul is looking up, not up, but down." And so I thought I'd just maybe end with that quote there, and that it relates to the picture that I have behind me. It's a section of the School of Athens painting in which Aristotle is standing next to Plato, and Plato is pointing up and Aristotle's pointing down. And that's that difference between up and down. And I think what Socrates is saying here is that looking up is looking to the invisible, that which we can't see. And sometimes that's more important than what we can see. And so I wanted to end it there for today. It's been a wonderful discussion, absolutely great discussion. And very much looking forward again, as I said, to 2 weeks where we'll wrap up our 6-session series on the Republic. We'll read from 587b through to the end of book 10 at 621b. So that'll be in 2 weeks, and then we'll take a break for the holidays, and we'll see what we'll encounter when we start again in January. So again, thank you all for a great discussion today. I will end the recording, and then those who wish to stay online just for a casual session of Plato's Cafe for a half an hour, more than welcome to. And again, I hope to see everybody in 2 weeks. So thank you very much.